Okay, so our presentation tonight is butterflies and other pollinators of the Mountain Loop Highway, how a project on the National Forest evolved. This will be a tag team presentation by Phyllis Reed and David Droppers. Phyllis is the North Zone Wildlife Biologist for the U.S. Forest Service on the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. She has spent most of her career on that forest in various roles, from seasonal wildlife ranger to wildlife biologist, environmental coordinator, ecosystem resource administrator, and acting district ranger. One of her major roles currently is working with an interdisciplinary team to enhance wildlife habitats through managing vegetation. So Phyllis is going to start, and David's going to take over, and then Phyllis is going to wrap up for us. Many of you, of course, know David Droppers, as he has given many wonderful presentations to the Washington Butterfly Association. He has been teaching courses on topics from butterflies to birds to trees to microorganisms for a variety of groups. I even hear you're doing a presentation on entomophagy.
Entomophagy.
Say it again.
Entomophagy, the intentional eating of insects for nutrition and calories.
Indeed. So, quite the Renaissance man. He has put, go ahead.
No, sorry, I apologize. Go on.
He has put his expertise to work for the National Forest Service, National Park Service, University of Washington, and Woodland Park Zoo, among many other organizations. David is ecstatic about sharing his passion for the natural world with others who wish to learn. I have to say, David was my first butterfly teacher, and I'm here to witness that his enthusiasm is contagious. So thank you both for being with us tonight, Phyllis and David. And Phyllis, do you want to share your screen and go ahead and get started?
Okay, is the screen up now?
It is, we can see it.
All right, well, thank you very much for asking me to share a little bit about what a wildlife biologist on the Forest Service does with butterflies and its habitats. So what I was going to do was start out with a little bit about, well, what does a wildlife biologist do for the Forest Service? Because it is a varied role. But let's see. And let's see, my advance does not seem to be going now.
You might need to click on the screen just to activate it.
Okay, let's see if I get up there. Okay. This is what wildlife biologists are perceived to do. Lots of people think we're out riding the range or with charismatic animals, or lots of TV programs might portray biologists in another role. And then there's what Hollywood thinks we do, lots of drama. What I like to think we're doing is with the wildlife monitoring, and but what I spend a lot of time is actually in front of the computer screen. So what do we do with the wildlife program on the forest? Well, we implement our forest plan, and we have the National Forest Management Act, which asks us to maintain viable populations of all existing native and desired non-native vertebrate species. Well, that's expanded a little bit, but every species counts for the wildlife, but in the Forest Service, some species are more equal than others. We've got federally listed species that we get to consult on, and that's the gray wolf in the North Cascades, the grizzly bear. The National Park and the Fish and Wildlife Service are just starting again an environmental impact statement on augmenting the North Cascades with grizzly bear. We have the northern spotted owl, which is an old forest associate species, and the marbled murrelet with the population, a seabird that forages on saltwater and flies inland to nest in the forest. We also have critical habitat for marbled murrelet and spotted owl. So we also have a number of species that are regional forest or sensitive species. These are species of concern that they do not become listed. California wolverine, the harlequin duck, Townsend biggered bat, our little Mayo's brown bat, which has had a lot of concern with the white nose syndrome. And then we get to some butterflies, Johnson hairstreak, Melissa arctic, Valley silver spot butterfly, western bumblebee, some of pollinators, suckling cuckoo, frigid bumblebee, high country bumblebee. But then we go back to some of the other species that we have, including snails, goshawk, and white-tailed ptarmigan, which was just proposed for listing. So I've got a lot of species that we're trying to provide for. We also have some of what we call management indicator species from our forest plan. The spotted owl is a management indicator species, so is the bald eagle, mountain goat, and we have a few other of these management indicator species, which are umbrella species, which if we provide habitat for those species, then hopefully we're providing for a number of other species. And let me see, and the 1994 Northwest Forest Plan that amended our plan added snails and some of the other mollusks. We have other species of concern, which include just songbirds, anything covered under the Migratory Bird Act, the Bald and Golden Eagle Act. So we have golden eagles. And then deer and elk, we have forest plan management areas specifically for covering for those types of species. So the wildlife biologist with the Forest Service is really focusing a lot on wildlife habitat, trying to protect, manage, improve habitat for a lot of species. So what do we know about the butterfly and bumblebees on the forest? Not a whole lot. So way back in 2009, there was a region-wide survey effort that was initiated for Johnson's hairstreak butterfly. And I was extremely fortunate to have David Droppers recruited to do surveys on the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. And at that point, I'm going to do a drum roll and switch to David Droppers' efforts, not just with the Johnson hairstreak butterfly, but onto a bigger, grander adventure with the mountain loop. So I'm going to stop share, or you can pull up yours, David, and that will stop me sharing.
That it will. Let's see here. Oh, darn it. I'm usually an expert at this. All right, how's that?
We're good. Yeah, we see you.
And you see the cursor?
I see the cursor too.
Perfect. Okay. So I know I've given this topic, I know I've given this presentation a couple of times as far as like kind of seasonal updates. So I'll do a little bit of that here, but the main thing, since this is a tag team with Phyllis and how these projects evolve and contribute to the forest plan and a lot of these species management, this is going to be kind of a summary and highlights of what I found in total on this project, especially since this was probably my last full year of surveys. Next year, I have a couple little odds and ends I need to tie up with individual trails, but I'm not surveying any new trails next year. This is kind of the quote unquote beginning of the end, so to speak, on this, and which in a way I'm a little sad about, but at the same time, you know, you're kind of ready to move on to new things after a while, and nothing says I can't revisit it in a decade or two. So yeah, summary and highlights of the entire project. These are pictures from Mount Pugh. I surveyed 3 trails this year, along with a couple other kind of, once again, odds and ends, filling in little holes in data on other trails. There we go. So zooming on a Mountain Loop Highway, just a refresher for folks that might not know exactly where it is. I defined my study area between Darrington and Verlot, so the highway between those two towns and any trails you can get to from there. There's a satellite view and a quick overview of kind of where the 12 trails are that I was surveying. So the trails I did this year were this one called Lost Creek Ridge. You might see in trail guides as Round Lake. It's very remote. Rarely did I see anyone else up there, which was, well, we'll say great. But this was the habitat. You did about 4,000 feet of forest climbing, and then you broke out into these subalpine meadows, just continuous ridge running with views to the south. So you're on a southern exposure. This was the only trail I found a actual colony of waterfall blues, which I had kind of suspected because this actually has a direct corridor to the meadows around Glacier Peak, where they are known to be, and it just seems like they might just have poor dispersal ability because they do feed on lupins as larvae, and you have trails like Mount Dickerman that has lots of lupins, and you're thinking, why aren't waterfalls here when silvery blues are here, Anna's blues are here? And it seems like waterfalls might just not have that good of a dispersal capability. And so I said, if there's one trail I'm going to find them on, it's going to be Lost Creek Ridge, and there they were. North Fork Sauk River Trail, which is a long name for a trail, but this was an absolutely stunning trail, 12 miles round trip, but only 1,000 feet of elevation gain. So, I mean, it was some real nice smooth walking of really old, majestic trees, punctuated by avalanche zones with numerous butterflies in the avalanche zones. But I primarily chose North Fork Sauk River Trail to see if it's an old growth forest, see, hey, how much mistletoe is in there, and can I find a new colony of Johnson hair streak? And I did. And we'll see a map a little later as far as where I have actually seen them, but I didn't just see one. I found numerous all throughout the trail on there. I thought I'd just quickly add this in since Phyllis mentioned it, the white-tailed ptarmigan. This was one of my target species on Mount Pugh. Mount Pugh was the other one that I've done, and I have seen that the white-tailed ptarmigan have been found there, and so I quickly threw this in for folks. I did find a female and 4 chicks running around just below the summit, so that was a lifer bird for me, and photos aren't that great because it was taken with my macro camera that's more for my butterfly photos, but I did the best I could. So once again, this is more of a summary and highlights. So the summary of the project, the data I was submitting to the Forest Service was, so I want a species inventory for each trail. I want a flight period. When do these things fly? And I'll be working on more detailed flight periods after I wrap things up next year. A relative abundance of each species, just to kind of give a baseline for monitoring and any future surveys, just to see if there's been any changes. I say relative abundance because, we all know butterfly numbers fluctuate from year to year based on a myriad of factors. So I want to say, hey, is this common? Is this uncommon? Is this abundant? It gives you some kind of relative idea of what to expect in future surveys. And then namely, this is what the Forest Service is really interested in, is what nectar sources were they using kind of to aid in restoration efforts. Phyllis, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Phyllis has said it's kind of been a dream of the Forest Service to do pollinator restoration work, but of course most of their money is tied up in fighting fires these days. But then the idea is, well, they've never had the money to hire a taxonomist to see what's actually flying out there and to do these population surveys. So how would we know if restoration efforts did any good? And if we didn't have this data to begin with, well, what would we know even to start with to plant? So that's where all this data was going to come in. And of course, what drew me to this area? I mean, this is in Eastern Washington. I'm not getting 40 species a day. This isn't a myriad of diversity. I think my record was 16 species. I think I've hit that twice, or maybe I got 17 this year. So you get what I mean. It's not a dizzying array of species and stuff like that. It's quite a few butterflies, but it was a good day if I hit double digits on the Mountain Loop Highway. So people are like, well, so then what did attract you to this area? Well, one, I've always enjoyed when my hiking, my surveys actually contribute to something more than just my own enjoyment. I still get enjoyment out of it. But I love it when the data I collect actually goes towards some kind of effort. This is one reason why a lot of birders report that they love eBird a lot more than just writing it in their, their little journals, and then their little journals just sit on their desk and never being used by anyone. It's a poorly sampled region. I mean, it was pretty much just an empty spot on the butterfly map. So it's one of those things I look there and go, well, have people been surveying it and they actually found nothing? Or is it just that nobody's looking? And it's also relatively close to home. I mean, I live in Linwood. If I want to go to the legendary Reeser Creek, it's the 2.5-hour drive, 5 hours round trip. That's a long time. I can get to a trailhead in an hour 15 minutes on the Mountain Loop Highway. And just to kind of show you an example of how poorly sampled this region was, these are all the county records I found. So we have Sylvan Hairstreak, Moss's Elfin, Arctic Blues, a field crescent, 2 field crescents were found this year, numerous locations of Colorado branded skipper, or the Western branded skipper. I found, and we'll go over this in more detail later, I found a colony of Celestrina asheri, the Asher's blue, the newly described blue. And believe it or not, I found the county record for a pale swallowtail. That's how uncommon this area is. And it's not necessarily, it's uncommon, but it's not rare by any means. And once again, what drew you to this region? This kind of a view drew me to this region. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. Subalpine and alpine are one of my favorite habitats to survey, because it's just this night and day transition between 10 feet of snow in the winter and bountiful wildflowers in the summer. You go to an old growth forest, other than maybe the snow, not as drastic of a difference in January to July. But these are some of the specialty butterflies that I would find up in these high elevations. Things like Arctic fritillaries, Mormon fritillaries, Western whites, which I'm still trying to decide, man, are these residents? Are these resident breeders here? Or are these dispersing individuals? And so far, I've only ever found males, but this year, of course, I found females, and I found a mating pair. So I'm going, okay, like I really don't know anymore. At first I thought, no, this all seems to be supporting just dispersing males from the east side. And now that's being thrown into doubt. We got checker spots, which Pelham's dissection show they're Onychia checker spots. I have yet to find larvae on the numerous penstemons on those mountainsides, but still looking. Always a special time when you find one, because there's only a handful of colonies I've found so far, but when you find them, they're usually pretty common. And then the Western branded skipper that I talked about, which were county records, but they seem to be on just about every mountaintop that I've been to. And then once again, those kind of views, that's the top of Mount Pugh. That's what you climb a full mile to get to. And it was a little humbling to be able to see the entirety of my study region that I've spent the last 7 years of my life working on in one view. But this was one of those views that I would have to literally pry myself off the mountaintop and say, no, David, you've got butterflies to study down below. Stop gawking. But these are the ones I would call like the dominant butterflies. I started looking at all the records I had, the number of records, flight times, whatever. And these butterflies stood out as far as having noticeably more records than any of the other butterflies. So Clodius parnassians, I call the dominant butterfly of the Mountain Loop Highway, even though I had more records of the margin white. Why I call the parnassian the dominant is because it is common from riverside, highway side, all the way up to subalpine, whereas margin white largely stuck to the lower elevation. I didn't see too many of them higher up in the subalpine meadows, whereas the Clodius was everywhere. And then same thing with the Western meadow fritillary, consistent and everywhere. But this whole project started with me finding a Johnson hairstreak. It's one of those with a lot of us reflect on these little moments in our life, thinking, if that wouldn't have happened, how would my life be different? And literally, if 2008 had not had I can't remember if it was a La Nina year, but 2008 was another really late spring year. I mean, this July 19th for a Johnson hairstreak is extremely late. And so it's one of those things I reflect on. If that hadn't happened, if I wouldn't have been there at that exact time and found this, what would I be doing right now? So it all started with that Johnson hairstreak on the Monte Cristo Trail. You see all the remnants of the mistletoe infestation in these old hemlocks. And 10 years later, 2018, when I officially surveyed Monte Cristo, bam, there it is again. So it's still there on the it's still there on the Monte Cristo Trail. And here's all the records I found so far. So Monte Cristo Trail, and then out on the North Fork Sauk River Trail in numerous spots on the trail. But there's a number of habitats up there that I think this is probably a lot more widespread than we think. So we'll see how much that updates in the future. Other highlights: a resident population of Juba skipper, not a long one, maybe a temporary colony. But in 2017, well, so in 2016, I found this worn male at Independence Lake. And Juba skippers are not unknown from straying west. So I thought, okay, cool, this is a cool stray record. That's neat. Well, then in 2017, I continued to do my surveys, and I found 5 more at 4 different locations. So I'm like, holy cow, and they were fresh in May. So I'm thinking, oh, these aren't all strays. This is a resident colony, widespread. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, 2014, 15, 16, those were all low snow years. These guys probably were able to eke out a little bit of eke out some survival during those more mild winters. But I have not seen any Juba skippers since 2017. So I think I just actually came upon a temporary colony at one point in time that is probably now gone, but will probably reestablish itself during some other mild winter. And this was the surprise of 2022. They were more widespread than just this, but there was this particular avalanche chute along the North Fork Sauk River Trail. And I called it the hemlock chute because it's bisected by this big hemlock. And this avalanche chute is just choked with dogwood. And azures were all over the place, echoes as well. But then I caught one female that had these characteristic dark markings of Asheri, and I'm thinking, a west side Asheri? No, that can't be. This has got to be just a dark. Well, I went back out, collected a few specimens, sent them to Caitlin, who's the one who described it, sent them to Caitlin and John, said, that's silvery blue right there, those markings on their side, that's Asheri. And I'm thinking, what is this doing out here? To be fair, they do say the middle one might be echo because it's not quite as silvery, but with the dark markings on the underside, I'm thinking there might be some cross species hanky panky going around there. But when you zoom out like this, it is a west side population, but it is pretty close to quote unquote Eastern Washington or to the crest. We're only about 2 miles away from the Chelan County border at this point. But just to give you a reference, like this is where the population was in the middle of this river valley. There's Glacier Peak. So I mean, how did this population end up here? So that was the surprise this year. I was almost a little bit upset that I found it, because of course I had to find it right after it was described. It's just like timing just seemed too serendipitous. So far I've found 46 species. I'm not expecting you to read all of this data here, just an idea of the different flight periods. You can see most species are flying in July and August. But yeah, 4 skippers, 1 Parnassian, 3 swallowtails, 5 whites, 1 sulfur, 2 coppers, 6 blues. Thank you, Asheri, for topping that one. 5 hair streaks, 3 greater fritillaries, 2 lesser fritillaries, 2 crescents, 1 checker spot, 4 commas, 3 tortoiseshells, 2 ladies, 1 admiral, and 1 alpine. Sounds like 12 Days of Christmas, but only one I'd actually like to take part in. I do have a number of species I'm surprised that aren't there, or maybe that I suspect they still might be. The brown elephant is probably the most surprising, but that's also because it's likely to be found in clear cuts. Early successional stages of forest really do not occur between Verlotte and Darrington, although there are some recent clear cuts and thinning that have occurred. So who knows, in 5 to 10 years, this could be a mountain loop highway butterfly, at least within my study area. The dreamy dusky wing, I really need to spend more time along the river. They're not a subalpine species, they're low elevation. And I just really haven't spent that much time there. The Sonora skipper, I was expecting to maybe find some in these high alpine wet, not high alpine, these subalpine wet meadows. And unfortunately, I've sampled them during prime time and did not find them. So I'm kind of thinking, if they're there, they're certainly hiding from me. Every Parnassian I find on the mountaintop, I'm catching. I'm trying to turn it into a mountain Parnassian, the Smintheus, but they all turn out to be Clodius. There's a fair number of colonies of stonecrop, of sedum up there. And Al Wagar and others, they've found some west side Smintheus population. So is it out of the question that it could be up there? No, it's not out of the question. And Great Spangled Fritillary, that probably is approaching the realm of like a grail species. But, you know, there's the Monte Cristo Trail, that kind of has some habitat that's reminiscent of some of the east side populations I've seen. So, I mean, if Asheri can make it over there, then surely Great Spangleds can. Just a little note on the moths of the Mountain Loop Highway, just because you don't not notice moths when you're out there. So I've just been casually keeping data on this. Jerry Austin and I, we've spent a number of nights just out recreationally light trapping out there. And this is what we've come up with. No, I'm not going to read off this list, but this just gives you an idea of, you know, okay, there's a fair number that only have a couple of species. You can see the geos dominate, but 140 species so far just via casual observation and recreational trapping. Not through any real concerted systematic efforts. So that number is undoubtedly way higher than that. But this is kind of the, let's see, so yeah, geometrid 60 species, noctuids, 28s. I haven't done a lot of September lighting, so probably a lot of Euxoa I'm missing out of that. And then as far as the other piece of data I was collecting were the what nectar sources are the adults using? And so far I've recorded 63, and I'll explain why that's in quotation marks. 63 current nectar records with asters, fleabane, and pearly everlasting all tying currently for the top spot at 16 different species of butterflies utilizing it for nectar. Running up behind that is bistort, kind of mostly high elevation sites. Generally, I don't find them abundantly visited, but they're consistently, whereas the previous three, they're usually, if they're blooming in full bloom, they're abundantly visited by butterflies. Yeah, bistort, not so much, it's consistent. Sitka valerian is kind of the, it used to be #1, but it's still a very popular early season nectar source. So before the fleabanes bloom, before the asters bloom, fleabane is the go-to nectar source for most butterflies. I believe I've only found one species of arnica up there. There's probably more, but it's a widespread nectar source for mid to high elevations. And kind of like bistort, it's used by a variety of butterflies, but not really abundantly, kind of on the fly. And then this is why I had a quotation around 63. I call it just yellow composites, because it's I call it a group of similar looking species beyond my current skills and namely time to identify with any confidence. One species I did identify to the genus Crepsis because I did find a Juba skipper nectaring on it. So when a Juba skipper is nectaring on it on the Mountain Loop Highway, I'm thinking, I want to know what that is. I've seen at least 6 different species using that species. So yellow composites, I found 10 different butterflies using those, probably a lot of diversity hidden within there. And then bumblebees. Phyllis mentioned the western bumblebee and the Suckley cuckoo bumblebee as being species of interest. And when I started this project, she asked, hey, how do you know your bumblebees? And I said, not very well, but I've always been looking for a reason to get into there. So they said, well, okay, namely, we want to know if you can find any Bombus occidentalis out there, the western bumblebee, which used to be one of our most abundant bumblebees, but then has suffered great decline. And while I can say I have not definitively found any western bumblebees on the Mountain Loop Highway yet, I still took data for what I could find. And so far, I've got 7 different species. Vast majority of the records are 2 species, the Sitka bumblebee and the black-tailed bumblebee. But Flavitus, which is one of the cuckoo bumblebees, I've also found to be common. Flavifrons, the yellow-headed, I would call uncommon. Vosnesensky, the yellow-faced, I've only found a handful of workers at one site once. That's one of the most common butterflies you see in your backyard. I've only found one mixtus, which is another very common bumblebee you see down in the greater Seattle area, but only one record from up there. And then Bifarius, the two-form bumblebee, that's one that I've been having real trouble pinning down looks on. So I may have some records from it, but it's unconfirmed. So maybe not on that one. So what's the final product of this project going to be? Like, could it be a book, kind of like Caitlin's Butterflies of the St. Lahican? She was doing kind of very similar things to what I'm doing out there. So maybe that, probably a Lepidoptera Society publication or two. Could it just be a PDF that I send around to people that are interested? Or could it be a start of a long-term monitoring project? I got the baseline here. Do we revisit in 10, 20, 30 years and see how things are changing? Don't really know. That's the fun. On that note, yeah, so that's my summary of this project that's taken up a vast majority of or a good chunk of my adult life. So with that, I'll pass it to Phyllis.
Okay. So are we back on to pollinator habitat?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Well, so how do we look at pollinator habitat on the National Forest? Well, there's challenges in maintaining habitat, how to have it adapt to change, some of the climate change considerations, fire, and just all the things that go with minimizing negative impacts and then enhancing habitat. So I'm going to go through some of these things of just how we try and work with challenges, minimize.
Phyllis,
and
you need,
yes?
do you have a slideshow to share?
Oh, sorry, I am not, is this not, yes. Okay, let me get to screen 2. Are we on now?
Yes.
Sir.
Okay, thank you. What I'll be trying to tell is some slides just on what's happening with like I said, the challenges of maintaining habitat, how we try and minimize some of the negative impacts, and then some of the work we do with enhancing habitat. So get back up here and see if it will let me go down. So maintaining habitat, one of the things is we look at trying to protect some of the unique habitat and wetland areas, meadow areas, some of the alpine areas are areas that when we're doing projects, we very much want to identify areas that may be good pollinator habitat. We're also looking at what's happening with some of the climate change, and there's a couple of photos of Image Lake area that you can see up in the black and white. That was a photo taken by a mountaineers group that were climbing Glacier Peak in 1921. And almost 100 years later, the photo 2016 shows how that area has changed. There's a lot more trees that have grown in after a fire. We don't have any sheep that are keeping down some of the vegetation. So there's a lot of looking at what's happening with climate change or other factors over time. We look at how we can maintain habitat with use of a variety of tools, and fire is one of the tools for doing some prescribed burning, which is more common over on the east side, but also pile burning and trying to maintain some of the early cereal habitat where you might have more of the forbs and shrubs that would be used by some of the pollinators.
So Phyllis, can you tell us what cereal habitat is?
Early cereal habitat, it'd be the species that would come in after disturbance in a forest. They're going to be the species that are the sort of the initiators and are the forbs, shrubs, and small trees, and those will get grown over by the trees and eventually become forests. So early cereal is the forb shrub stage of the forest. We also work with the fire folks in trying to look at wildfire suppression options. This is a fire that was Downing Creek fire in the Seattle drainage. You can see that it went from all the way from down at the river up to those wonderful meadow areas up at the peaks. So where we put some of the fire suppression efforts might be in those avalanche chutes or keeping the fire from moving into old forests that may be a benefit to some of the like spotted owl or old growth associates, but also being able to allow fire to provide some of that regeneration of the forest and the early sterile habitat. We try and do some minimizing of negative impacts. We have an environmental impact statement on herbicide use, and it's very limited and very targeted. And we also look at how we might be limiting or how we can limit competition to some of the pollinators, especially the native bumblebees, since we have a lot of interest in having honeybee apiaries on the forest. And then we look at how we can enhance habitat. And some of the enhancement is with other project or other management, such as our road management. On the left-hand side, you can see we have dense roadside trees, overhanging canopy. So there's a lot of shade and there's not much habitat along the edge of the road. If you open up the road, we call it daylighting, and get some of that tree off the road, it reduces some of the drip on the road, reduces the amount of puddling that stays on the road and creates potholes when people drive too fast. And it also provides for lots of habitat along the edge for some of those yellow composites that David was talking about. Now, this is a balancing act because some of those species are invasives, and we're trying to not encourage perhaps invasive species, but this is an example of how road management may be a benefit to some of the pollinators.
Phyllis?
Yes?
Can I interrupt? Can I add on a point to that?
Sure.
So what I'm currently doing is I'm analyzing my numbers to see what is the biggest predictor of diversity on my inventories, and so far Mount Dickerman has the highest diversity. But when I control for migrant species, Monte Cristo actually comes out on top as far as having the most resident species of butterflies, and I attribute that because it used to be a road. You used to be able to drive up there. It's not a closed-in forested trail. It's very open, and you have a lot of this daylighting. And you're absolutely correct. There are quite a few invasive species along that road, but the butterflies are using them. And so I attribute I attribute that diversity on Monte Cristo to the fact that it is so wide open and sunlit. Even though it only traverses 400 feet of elevation, Mount Dickerman traverses 4,000 feet of elevation, so you're getting low elevation species and high elevation species. Monte Cristo traverses a tenth of that, and yet it actually dominates the list as far as the number of resident species of butterflies. And I attribute it to that.
Right. So managing for diversity of habitat, which was the next point, really is part of that, part of the management strategy for looking at a number of different species. And this is a lot of what our forest looks like. We've got a mix of second growth and old forest. This is up the North Fork of the Stillaguamish. And what we're looking at doing with some of these stands is what we look at is habitat enhancement with thinning projects. And this is some drone photos from the Department of Natural Resources on a thinning project in which there's some gaps created, and we're trying to get more light to the forest floor, which would provide for understory development and increase of species that might be used by pollinators. Another thing we can do when we do thinning is to look for mistletoe development. Now, lot of the timber management would be, no, we don't want mistletoe because they create those big branches and those brooms in the canopy. But if they get shaded out, then you lose some of the vibrant mistletoe clumps, which you can see on the left-hand side. And the Johnson hairstreak butterfly is associated with mistletoe, but also the marbled murrelet nesting habitat, those big platforms of multiple branches end up providing nesting habitat. So when we're doing some of our planning for thinning, it's like looking at several different species and what their habitat needs are and how we can try and manage the forest to accommodate for various species. And then meadow and huckleberry enhancement. The huckleberries and the vacciniums are a species in which we have a lot of the bumblebees that will use it. And then in those openings where we do have meadows or where there has been past timber harvest, you can get some of the species that, again, are not what you would find under the forest cover. And this is an example of what we talked about. David Droppers has done a great job of looking at nectaring species, because that's one of the things that we wanted to do, is develop an erosion seed mix with plant species that would be favored by pollinators. And Pearly Everlasting is one of those that not only is a great species for butterflies and bees, but also is a great one for some of the forage animals. So again, it's looking at taking information that comes from the surveys that David has done to try and incorporate into our erosion seed mix for not only where we have ground disturbance, but where we might be doing some forage enhancement. So managing for habitat, what is all this survey information, or how do we use it? We try and get the latest information, and that comes from having studies like David's, regional studies. We did an eDNA study on bee pollen that was collected from flowers in 2021. The Xeris Society has been great in providing information. And then it's partners and having citizen science like what David has done. And I use this input on projects in our interdisciplinary teams and putting out environmental assessments with proposed actions. And that's where there's an opportunity for the public to get involved in providing comments back on environmental assessments and identifying issues that are important to them. We do consultation with other agencies and other interested parties with Fish and Wildlife Service in trying to keep species off the endangered species list. And we look for opportunities for surveys and monitoring. And so to me, the efforts that David has done has just been an incremental jump in the information that we know about butterflies and pollinators on the forest. It's benefiting us in being able to look at how we can put together, like I said, our species mix for ground disturbance and for future work with early seral habitat. So that ends my part of the presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you, and I would like to offer time to entertain questions.
So there is a question in the chat, Phyllis. You talked very clearly about how difficult it is to do the balancing, for example, between diversity and fostering invasives. There's a question about balancing daylighting for pollinators with amphibian needs.
Right. A lot of those, we also, with the amphibian needs, we look at our riparian areas and just what we do with aquatic organism passages and being able to have culverts that are friendly not only to fish, but to other species like the amphibians for being crossings. So it's trying to enhance those areas in the I'd say in the locations where you would have the highest probability of having amphibians. And so we do look at riparian area management differently than upland management.
Okay. So another question in the chat. Well, several questions actually. What about terrestrial salamanders? I know this isn't butterflies, but it's interesting.
Terrestrial salamanders?
Yes.
Oh, well, I think with those, the diversity of habitat is one of the things that we are trying to look at, so that you have a lot of different stages of forest conditions so you can accommodate the different species needs. But it would really depend on where you are on the forest and what type of project that you're proposing to do.
Okay, so Regina, does that answer your question about questions about salamanders?
Not really, because I have read some about forest abandonment in forests and stuff like that, logging road abandonment, and forest roads are known to disrupt terrestrial salamander migrations. And so I was wondering how that gets balanced with the daylighting that you do for pollinators.
I think that's where, again, if we've got information of where there are some of those migration routes with some of the toads, then you can, I believe there's been places, and this may have been on the east side, where they actually had like seasonal closures.
Did you have any other comments, Regina?
Oh, that's fine, thanks.
So there's another question in the chat, probably for, well, for both of you. Is David a volunteer? If not, how did the Forest Service allocate funding for this exciting project?
Phyllis, you want to start on that one?
Well, this is one where funding has been in short supply. So David has been doing this on his own on that. So it's an incredible effort from David to tackle this.
I guess I'll add, so I'm not even an official volunteer of the Forest Service. This is more of an independent research project that just happens to coincide with the Forest Service, with their goals and interests. So, but in that, I do want to kind of make one final encouragement to everyone listening, is that like I'm not doing anything particularly special. What I'm doing can be done by anyone. If you have a favorite wildlife refuge or natural area, all you have to do is one, contact the manager, say, hey, what is currently known? What would you like to know? These are my interests or specialties. And you can coordinate with them and say, hey, I would love to visit once a week, once a month, once every 2 weeks. Record this data and submit it to you. And that's one way you can help. I mean, Forest Service, as well as a number of other agencies and state agencies, do not have the funding to hire a bunch of field taxonomists. They just don't. And so the reason why I do it is, well, one is just personal interest. But as I said, my part of the presentation, I just enjoy when what I'm finding actually contributes. So this is, I encourage you, don't think of this project as particularly, as something that's out of your reach. You can do this, and you should do this.
Right.
That's my 2 cents.
If there's interest in terrestrial salamanders and how they're moving across the landscape, any additional information on that is helpful to have for when we're looking at designing projects and having design elements that can accommodate those species.
So apart from individual action, is there anything people could do to advocate with the agency, Phyllis?
Well, I think one of the things that the agency does is when we have a large project, and a lot of these projects have gone to being landscape scale, projects is to be aware of what's happening in an area that you're interested in, whether it's the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest or Gifford Pinchot or East Side. There's the forest put out, or you can go on our forest websites and see what projects are happening. And there's opportunities for people to provide input as far as what are some of the issues that you're interested in, and to review actually what's being proposed. And if you find something in there that is of concern, you know, definitely contact the project leader. There's contact names and numbers to get back to the Forest Service on, and provide input on how we can design our project to, like I say, better accommodate the species of concern.
Okay, thank you. John, I know you had some comments to make. Are you prepared to do that now, JP?
I can stop sharing now if that's fine with folks.
Yeah, sure, that's fine, Phyllis. Thank you.
Okay, it's up to me, huh?
Well, you seem to have some comments, questions, so fire away.
Phyllis, you know, first of all, I was very impressed with your knowledge base. I was informed. I was delighted to find out that marbled murrelets will use mistletoe. Yeah, that was just amazing. That bodes well for Johnson's hair streaks and the mistletoe. This will work out. You know, you got 3 individual elements that are a concern. That's great. I was also very impressed and pleased that you recognized the importance of serial evolution in maintaining biodiversity. Obviously, nature is dynamic. It was before we got here. It will be after we're gone. But that dynamism, you know, has to be constrained when you have things like forest fires that can range out of control. You understood this very, very well, and I really appreciated your understanding of that. I have one caveat, and that is that, you know, pile burning, you know, I think we might have a member of our, you know, audience here that would observe, you know, object to that. You know.
Hey, don't take my name in vain too much.
Okay.
And David, as for, you know, you're encouraging people to go out and do what you did, that's really well and good, but there's very few people I know personally that have your wheels. All right. So like, you know, going out and doing what you do, keeping data, which is what you've done, is like, you know, it's marvelous. It's really an amazing thing. More on that in a minute. But to expect people to chase you around a mountainside is like, you know, really expecting a lot. And you have a unique ability, and that's just the way it is. So now, as for what you do with this, I wouldn't be in a hurry. It took Caitlin a long time to do her Sinhalhekan book. Take your time and do it. I will say this, and this is from Caitlin's experience as well. You take the time to do it, you will provide, you know, a tremendous, you know, resource to the community. It will be worthwhile to anyone who reads it. And, you know, like you've already given me a lot of the data, so it's really an important resource for the community already. But, and this is like from experience too, you will benefit most of all because your intimate understanding will network in ways that you can't possibly imagine now. And so, you know, that's pretty much what I would say with that. I'm done. I'm out. Drop the mic. Drop the mic.
Well, so I'll piggyback on John. Thank you, John, for the comments. I'll piggyback on that when I mean, maybe I'm trying to be humble here, but I guess what I meant is not necessarily climbing up mountains. I'm not saying everyone can do that, but I'm saying, you know, if you have an area that you can access repeatedly, I mean, this is the same kind of scope of a project that anyone can do. I mean, I've heard Carl Barentine multiple times trying to be as humble as he can, but I mean, the name of the game is perseverance. Just keeping at it to the point that you get the massive data collections that, you know, that him and I have with our respective taxon. Pyle, what you got?
David, that was a phenomenal presentation, and Phyllis, both of you. I want to say that first off, echo everything Jonathan said. And also first, before the name of Carl Barentine gets too cold, Carl, you're a work of nature, an act of nature, and you're a field of nature. So thank you. But David and Phyllis, the cooperation is superb. Come back with me half a century to the beginning of the Xerces Society and our earliest efforts to engage with the Forest Service. I've always had a lot of time for the Forest Service, worked for them and so on, but I've also fought with them a lot, as many in conservation have. And a lot of it was because Forest Service was acting, you know, at the order of the Senate to get the cutout. And that put him often in an unwieldy situation. But there's always been a desire, in my experience, on the part of many Forest Service personnel to do the right thing by the resource. And when they get a chance and have the funding, have the personnel do so, it can be really something to watch. I believe the very first in-print reference that I know of as a historian of butterfly conservation of the Forest Service getting involved with the butterfly, a rare butterfly in this country, at least in the West, was with the Sandia hair streak in New Mexico. This in the 70s that we lobbied for. And I've got that document. And that was early. And there's very little until the Endangered Species Act forced some cooperation on the Oregon silver spot and the Siuslaw National Forest, which has always been deeply involved with that, of course. But now bring it forward these 50 years and to see what the Gifford Pinchot is doing with the golden hair streak and the golden chinkapin, a big change from when we first started to get some of that looked at 25 years ago. And then to see this, Phyllis, and to see your career, extremely varied, dedicated career with the Forest Service, to take this on at this stage is absolutely thrilling. And I have to, you know, I'm a big National Park Service advocate as well. And the same goes there for Regina on that. But this is wonderful. So thank you for the very clear explanation of how you're going about it and where it came from. That's going to mean a lot to all of us. And now coming over to your colleague and tag team partner, David Droppers. What a great tag team. David, you're a phenomenon of nature too. We know that. If you've been in the field with this guy, or in the car after a field trip, you know he's a power. And David, what you do is the field of ecology called faunistics, of course. It's the study of the actual nature of the fauna around us. And you do that by survey. And there's a big difference between the kind of survey that you're doing on the mountain loop and the kind that a great many people do these days, equally valuable in a different context, which is the pollard walk-based transects. That's one form of repetitive data gathering, which is related to the 4th of July butterfly counts too, of course, of trying to get a repetitive data in one place. But I find those transects for myself extremely frustrating because I want to cruise the countryside and find every species I can, not count a limited profile of land in a repetitive way. It takes all types. That's very important work. But for you to get out there with your energy, your acumen, your understanding of the fauna, and then to bang it, to really bring home the data. Once again, let me use the word thrilling. So that's my kudos to you both, and my huge thanks for doing that. A couple quick questions. And one of them is, David, that first picture you showed of the Johnson's hair streak, what was that nectar source? It was a big tower of a plant. It almost looked like bear grass. I don't think that was valerian, was it?
Let me pull it up. And while I'm doing so, yeah, your points about, you know, my not doing a pollard walk or a point count or anything like that, these really these more rigid counts that are then more comparable across time. I definitely thought about doing that, you know, and just kind of thinking how this isn't the word I want to use, but scientific, you know, how rigid do I want to be here? And that was definitely something I've thought about. And to be honest, this project has changed throughout time, that, you know, maybe 3 years into the project kind of think, man, I wish I would have gone back and done that instead. But, you know, with a multi-year project, that's always going to happen.
Well, they got overlapping goals.
Yes, and I'm a different person than I was 7 years ago. I got different goals. I mean, that's going to happen. But we'll see. So this is the one you're talking about, right?
Correct. What's that plant?
That's elderberry.
Elderberry.
That's elderberry, and it's strange. Elderberry is not uncommon on the Mount Loop Highway, and yet I have one record of a butterfly using it. Or I think maybe I've seen cedars using it too, granaeus.
That's red elderberry?
I did not make a note.
The florets look so big. Huh, that's weird.
We have both blue and red elderberry, so it could be either.
That's interesting because I've never seen any species of butterfly nectar on either species of elderberry, nor have I on beargrass, which was my hypothesis. No, it's not beargrass. Okay, thank you for that. That's fascinating.
What was do you still see the picture of the butterfly?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not just following my screen. I'm gonna pull up really quick because on the North Fork Sauk River Trail. I've never found any nectar records for Johnson hairstreak before this past year. And on the North Fork Sauk River Trail, I found 4. There was elderberry, there was saxifrage, this one called waterleaf. I think it's Phacelia, I think.
Yeah.
Oh wait, I could look at a better, and then the cow parsnip.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so it's like, so this year on that trail, I happened to get, you know, a bunch of, well, 4 may not be considered a bunch. Oh, hydrophyllum is waterleaf.
Yes.
And yeah, so this year all of a sudden I got 4 nectar records for Johnson hairstreak on that trail after not having any. So, and the elderberry was a surprise.
Yeah, Julie's right, of course. This is columnar, so it would certainly be the red elderberry. Pelham and I also saw them nectaring, others have too, on the valerian and also on Mahonia or Berberis, Oregon grape, but on Cushman. Well, thank you for that. Now, another quick question. Well, first of all, comment, the YCs, the yellow composites.
Yeah.
You should know that the botanists have an extension of that term. They call them DYCs. Damn yellow composites.
Oh, LBJs, man.
Yeah, exactly. and then the other one is this. I was interested to see that your faunal list included 4 species of Drepanidae. I only know the 2, Arcuata and Bilineara. What other hook-tip moths did you find?
Oh, so that was a recent change where so things like Habracini, they've been condensed. I can't remember what the previous family was.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, all right.
But yeah, no, they were condensed. So things like Habracini's in there, and I forget off the top of my head which the other one is. But yeah.
Okay, we still only have the 2 Drepana.
We only have the 2 Drepana, yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you both so much. You've made my day.
Fantastic.
Wonderful work together.
Okay, we have a couple other questions too. Regina, do you want to unmute and ask?
I'm eating my dinner. Can you read it?
I will. So Regina is asking if others want to do something like this, how would they start out finding who to send their data to? So, you know, if you know, David has done a magnificent job of going back to the same area again and again, but are there, how would a person find who to send their data to if they, you know, didn't do a project quite like David's?
Well, so I guess all I can do is speak from my experience, where as soon as I kind of formulated this idea, I contacted the Forest Service. Well, first I met Phyllis because of the Johnson hairstreak surveys, so I got to know her through those surveys. But mostly it's find out who manages the land, or who has managerial responsibility of the land. There's a stewardship of the land, but, you know, find out if it's a state park, find out if it's a national forest or a national park, and send them an email. Like I said, a lot of these agencies are wanting people to do this kind of work. It could be county parks. Phyllis, do you have anything to add on that?
Right. If there's an area that's of particular interest to a person and you can get back to it, you know, I think of like the Big Four area just off the mountain loop that has the avalanche areas that create those ice caves. So you get a lot of differentiation in the vegetation just from some of the beaver ponds right at the beginning of the trail up to some of the end of the trail towards which has the more of a montane type of vegetation. So if there's like an area people are interested in and want to be able to visit, you know, a lot of times the information that they can provide just from those repeat visits are so valuable in setting what the baseline is or what's happening in that site at that time. Like David said, contacting the management agency for the area that you're interested in and just finding out if they've got any projects that are going on in the area and could utilize some of the survey efforts or the interests that you have.
And is that information available at U.S. Forest Service website?
Right. You can go online to any of the national forests, and there should be contact parties or at least the ranger stations, and just make a call and start saying, you know, who's your biologist and what projects are happening, or any of the contacts that you can make.
Okay, Allison, are you still with us? If so, could you unmute and mention what you put in the chat?
Sure. So I work on the Willamette National Forest and am a district biologist there. So I just put in some of the ways we've been able to get funding to do some of our work. And one of them is we can get grants from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. So, and recently they're interested in other species. So not only elk, but you can talk about pollinators there too, and get some meadow work done that way. And then also with the Xerces Society, they've come out and done some training on bumblebee identification. And we have, you can sign up for these cells to look for bumblebees. Of course, I'm always looking for butterflies too, but those are a couple ways you can get involved. So I just
mentioned too that just to add to what you're talking about, Allison, the way that I came on the idea of this project is I was doing some volunteer work with Conservation Northwest, and they had recruited a bunch of people that were working with grouse and one thing and another, elk, and so they were trying to clear a particular area to try to make it friendly to other species. And so the volunteers, there was a whole bunch of them, 20 or so, that were out basically pulling up invasive species. So the Forest Service had gone through and done some clearing, and then volunteers were going through and doing the kind of grunt work. So I think there are some opportunities with some of the conservation organizations too that are partnering right now with U.S. Forest Service, and that's how I found Phyllis, was through that project with the forester at was he at Gifford Pinchot? Yeah. So I didn't want to mention